You can start.
Okay. Today I would like to introduce a paper by Moscati and Gualmini to you, namely more facts that isomorphism cannot explain. A phenomenon which has attracted much attention by researchers in child language is the interaction between quantifiers and negation. And Mussolino, a person we should all know by now, has done a lot of research on this field, investigating the child's interpretation of sentences like "every horse didn't jump over the fence," or "the detective didn't find some guys." These sentences contain two scope-bearing elements, negation and a quantified NP. It is ambiguous. I don't think I have to explain that any further. We should be experts by now. However, one interpretation is the surface scope interpretation, or the so-called isomorphic one, because there the scope-bearing elements are interpreted in the order in which they appear. Whereas at the inverse scope reading, or non-isomorphic interpretation, they are interpreted in the opposite order. The question they asked themselves now was whether children can access both interpretations. And as Mussolini suggests that they strongly prefer surface scope interpretations, he proposed the observation of isomorphism. That means that the children's semantic scope coincides with our syntactic scope. So they prefer surface scope interpretations because they're that process the elements in the order in which they hear it. However, recent studies show that this is not the whole truth in sentences like "every horse jumped over the log, but every horse didn't jump over the fence." Children prefer the inverse scope reading, which suggests that their interpretation is controlled by context. So still,
One thing, could you speak a little bit closer to the microphone?
Yeah, well, I can try.
The audio was a little bit low.
Okay. But still, is it better now?
Better, yes, thank you.
But still, the question arises whether both interpretations are equal. And Gualmini argues that children do not have a default preference for surface scope reading, and rather they are guided by discourse relevance. And Mussolini states that they have a preference for surface scope reading and true interpretations. So that means interpretations that allow them to say yes in sentences when they were asked a question. We will see that later. But what's to mention here is that in most cases, there's a focus on the interaction between negation and a quantified NP. But nevertheless, they make predictions for sentences with other scope-bearing elements. So this paper, therefore, tries to find out to what extent these predictions hold for sentences containing negation and a modal operator. The two languages that were tested were Italian and English. And in both languages, there are sentences where adults strongly prefer the inverse scope reading. Just like in 9, the lion cannot be in the same cage as the tiger. In 10, we have the inverse scope reading. It is not the case that the lion can be in the same cage as a tiger. And in 11, we have the surface scope reading. It is possible that the lion is not in the cage, like the tiger. Some even argue that the surface scope interpretation is not really available in English. And to me, it took me really a lot of time to get that second interpretation. So maybe that supports this assumption. And in Italian, we have the same sentences. The only difference is that we have a different modal operator, namely devere or like must. And notice here that we have C commands. So the negation C commands the rest of the sentence. But still, inverse scope reading is preferred. So it is necessary, unfortunately, it is necessary that the lion is not in the tiger's cage. And the surface scope reading would be, it is not the case that the lion has to be in the tiger's cage. But that's the way that adults interpret the sentence. We now want to know what children do. when hearing such sentences, and that the following is what they.
Can I stop you a second?
Yeah, sure.
So I guess there is a typo either on the paper or in your presentation, right? Because I don't know if you see my mouse, probably not. So in sentence 12, right? In the logic form in 13 and 14, there is a diamond symbol, right?
Yeah.
And that should be a square, right? Because
in the paper it's a diamond. I don't know.
So I guess it's the
copied it. Yeah.
typo in the paper. Yeah. So the
I don't know.
diamond is the symbol that stands for the possibility model, right? So can.
Okay.
And must is a square in model logic representation. Just to tell you.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
Right. So yeah. So I also wanted to ask you: do you get both these interpretations in both sentences?
So what was the question?
Do you get both these interpretations?
Yeah, but for me, I don't speak Italian, but in mine, it was obvious for me that they meant the inverse scope reading. It really took me long to think of the surface scope reading. I never heard cannot be used in that way. So.
Does anyone? So your main language is German.
Yeah.
Right. Does anyone have problem in getting both interpretations in your own language or in English?
I don't get the 11 at all. I don't understand it.
Which one? Sorry.
I don't get the inverse interpretation of number 9.
Of 9, right? So the lion cannot be the same cage as the tiger. Yeah, I mean, in English, me neither, right?
But inverse scope is, can is the modal operator and not is the negation. So the inverse scope would be that not take scope over can. So it is not the case for the lion to be in the cage like the tiger. So that would, for me, it would be the most obvious interpretation.
Right. So that would be, yeah. So that would be the inverse scope, you mean?
Yeah.
Right.
Oh yeah, sorry, I mixed it up. Yeah, I meant the other one.
Yeah. Right.
Can I just point out that the translation of the sentence in number 12 is not ambiguous, because
okay, I got it now.
Because must not actually means that you're not allowed to do something as well.
Okay, yeah, but I figured 11 out now, so it's like the lion is able to not be in the same cage as the tiger, kind of.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
yeah, but I was saying that the translation of number 12 doesn't really result in 13 and 14. It actually only results in 14.
Yeah, I think it's not really the translation. It's just like every word was translated separately to see that the various must.
Yeah, but it should have been the lion doesn't have to be.
Exactly.
Okay.
Very good point.
Is something else.
Exactly. Very good point. So it may also be the case that the version of the paper that I posted is not the final version because there are some typos left in here, right? I don't even know if maybe they published the version, but I'm going to check it out. Anyways, the problem here also lies in the translation, right, between English and Italian. So in English, so one of the interesting facts is that in English you have this contracted form of cannot, right, which is cannot, right? And the interesting thing that in English it's very difficult to get the surface scope of can and not. So if you say cannot, it really means not can, right? But so one way to get the surface scope is to split two words. So you can say the lion cannot be in the same, right? I mean, I don't know if it works, but in my sort of Italian English.
Sorry,
I think it works best for me if I put in may instead of can. The lion may not be in the same page as the tiger.
Exactly, exactly. That's also very interesting. So what we are noticing, right? So our observation is that actually in English you have these two different versions of modals, right? Must and have to, may and can, and people discuss, what are the differences in the interpretation of these modals. So, some differences are about what kind of modal base you have, right? So if you're talking about the deontic model base or an epistemic model base, right? So the deontic is about the things that you're allowed or you're not allowed to do, and the epistemic is whether that is possible or not in the real course of the events. Now, the interesting thing is that these different words, like may with respect to can and have to with respect to must, have different scope interpretations, right? So if you want to have this particular kind of thing, exactly as you said, you should say the lion may not be in the same case as the tiger, right? Once you use can, it seems that automatically it triggers inverse scope for some interesting reason, right? And the same with the model. Now, there is another thing that these guys exhibit kind of interesting differences across languages. So in Italian, I can assure you that 12 is really, really ambiguous, right? So if you say 12, it's it also kind of makes sense since we don't have a verb like have to. I mean, we kind of have it, but it sounds very archaic, okay? Il leone ha da stare nella stessa gabbia con la tigre, either very archaic or southern Italian dialect. So in modern Italian, that's the only way to say that, and then you get this very strong ambiguity, okay? Yeah. So, right, so the two interpretations, just to make sure that everyone is on the same page, right? So one would be, it is not the case that the lion has to be in the tiger's cage, right? It can also be somewhere else, or it could be that the lion is somewhere else, but the other one is, it is necessary that the lion is not to be in the tiger's cage. So it must be somewhere else, right? Otherwise, I don't know, it's gonna fight with the tiger, I guess, right? So bear in mind that even here, we have another layer, another dimension of complexity. Just like we were discussing yesterday about numerals and their specific or non-specific interpretation and their exhaustive or non-exhaustive interpretation. Here, we have a problem of the ambiguity of the models between deontic and epistemic interpretation as well as their scope ambiguity, okay? So that's important to bear in mind, okay? So in the epistemic interpretation, to say the lion must be there, it means that according to all the evidence you have, the lion, in any situation that I'm considering, the lion is there. Whereas if you have the only interpretation, it means that the lion must be there because that's the right way for things to be. Otherwise, something is gonna be messy, like the lion is gonna fight with the tiger. Is this difference clear to you? Is what I'm talking about clear? You see this difference? I don't see your feedback.
Were you talking to me? Because I know the difference. I'm just saying that.
Yeah, to everyone. Yeah, great. Okay. Now I see your thumbs and I'm fine. Okay, sorry. Yeah, please go on. Sorry for the interruption.
No problem. What the author also mentions is that what's very interesting here is that on the inverse scope reading, it doesn't matter which modal operator they use because they have the same meaning. Yeah, but still, that's the way adults interpret this sentence. What they did to find out how children interpret this was the following. There was an experiment with 15 English-speaking children between 4 and 5 years, and they were told a story about Sue. Dora was working there, and her job was to put two animals, a hippo and a lion, in two different cages. And in one there's a giraffe, and in the other one there's a tiger. And the only instruction she had was 9. The lion cannot be in the same cage as the tiger. And then the children were told that she had forgotten what to do and she needs their help. So they were asked the questions in 15 and 16. Can I put the hippo with the tiger, and can I put the lion with the tiger? The 15 is the so-called pre-test question, and 16 is the actual test question. And the pre-test question is really important to evaluate this test correctly, because it helps us to see how children answer a question whose answer they don't know. Because if 9 is interpreted as the inverse scope reading, then they know that it's forbidden for the lion to be in the cage with the tiger. But if they interpret it on the surface scope, then they just know that it's possible for the lion not to be in the tiger's cage. But they can't say if it is forbidden. So the answer to 16 could be both, yes or no. So the surface scope interpretation would be underdetermined. It doesn't say anything if it's allowed for the lion to be in the cage. So you have to find out how children respond to underdetermined questions, and therefore we have 15. Because you have to make sure that they say yes, because they have no evidence that putting the hippo with the tiger could cause a problem. Because otherwise, if they would say no, you cannot know why they said no to 16. They could interpret 9 on the inverse scope and then say no because it is forbidden. Or they say no because they say no to every underdetermined question when they don't know the answer. So all the kids that said no to 15 were excluded from the test. I hope that was clear. And the results were the following. The 15 kids were asked 4 questions, like 15, and out of these 60 questions, children answered yes 47 times, so nearly 80% said yes. And from the 47, 43 children answered no at the test question, so these are almost 92%. So it seems the children did not interpret 16 as underdetermined, which suggests that they interpreted also on the inverse scope reading. And in experiment 2,
can you go back again? Sorry, to the sentence 16, just to make sure that I right. So the question was, can I put the lion with the tiger, right?
Yeah.
And they all answered no, right?
Almost all children.
The lion with the tiger, because the lion cannot be in the same cage as the tiger. So they provided an adult-like interpretation, right?
Yeah, exactly. And experiment 2, there were Italian-speaking children, and with this experiment, they wanted to see whether the results from experiment 1 have anything to do with some special property of the English model system, or if it reflects a universal property to access the inverse scope reading at a sentence that contains modal operator and negation. And the children were told a similar story, but this time the modal operator was changed, and it was not can, but it was must or deve. And then they were asked the questions in 17 and 18, like in experiment 1, can I put the hippo in the tiger's cage? And can I put can the lion be in the tiger's cage? And the answers were nearly the same. So Italian children answered yes to the pretest question 59 times out of 86. And 52 children answered no to the test question out of 56. So these are nearly all children. So what we can conclude is that there is no real difference between these children, and inverse reading is always preferred. And they show the same reaction to underdetermined questions. all children tend to say yes when the context allows them to do so. And the children interpreted all sentences on the inverse scope reading, regardless of the modal operator and the position of the negation. So these results suggest that C command or the choice of modal operator does not have an effect on the computation of the truth conditions or the semantic interpretation. Yeah, I hope it was all clear. I don't know if you have any questions, but that's it.
Thank you very much. I do have a question. I did not quite understand the very last thing that you said. So how do these results show that that the surface C command does not dictate the semantic interpretation? So I'm not, yeah. So
yeah,
how?
Yeah.
So I mean I'm not understanding the link between you know, the principle of charity and the you know, the second point, that regardless of the modal operator, blah blah blah, and then the fact that these factors don't have any effect on the computation of the truth condition and the surface command, just because they always do inverse scope. Is that what they claim?
Yeah, I mean, in Italian we have the C command, and where the negation C commands the rest of the sentence, but it is interpreted after the modal operator. It is interpreted on the inverse scope. So they think that the C command does not have an effect, because in English there is no C command, and it is also interpreted on the inverse scope. Well, that's the way I understood it.
Right. So this is super misleading, right? I mean, so it's not your fault, of course. The way they frame it is very misleading, right? So C command is just a property of a syntactic configuration. Okay.
Yeah.
So if you have inverse scope, the element that is narrower in the linear order, right, is moved above, and then it C commands the rest in the logic form. So there is always something C commanding something else, otherwise you wouldn't have a normal composition of the sentence, right? So what they want to say is that the surface scope interpretation is really never preferred in this kind of sentences, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, this is a very interesting experiment. I remember that I saw the presentation of this study right after they ran this experiment. I mean, I find a little bit weird that they changed the verb from English to Italian. So I think in a later version of this paper, they actually have both kind of models in both languages, but I'm not sure. I should ask info. So one of these two authors is actually a friend of mine, so I know him quite well. I know also Gualmini, but unfortunately Gualmini is not in academia anymore. But yeah, so I guess, you know, the strong point of this paper when it came out was to tell Mussolini and the other people that actually their isomorphism observation was not really general, right? Especially it wouldn't work in the case of models, because in models, everyone is very, very strong at computing the inverse scope interpretation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now there is, so first of all, is there any comment or any question by anyone?
Yeah, I have a question. Can you go back to the slide with the animals?
This one,
Yeah.
or
The one before. Where? Yeah, exactly. So, what instructions did the children get?
in 9, the only instruction they had was the lion cannot be in the same cage as the tiger.
Okay. And when asked, can I put the hippo with the tiger, children said yes, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, that's the only thing I wanted to know. Because I was thinking like maybe it was like a pragmatic inference, like you would think that you cannot put a hippo with a tiger just because, yeah, I don't know, tiger would eat a hippo, but that's why they took out the children who said no, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, is there any other question, any other comment, any other point of uncertainty? So, right. So one of the problems that I had with this work, right, is that to me it's not completely clear what children are supposed to do, even if they have. So there are two issues here, right? So the first one is that certain words appear to have a very sort of fixed pattern of scope. So I think cannot, right? If you compare cannot to may not, behaves differently. And I'm not really sure if there is a semantic reason why may not allows surface scope much more easily than cannot. Do you see this? You see this point? That if you say, yeah, so if you say the lion cannot be in the same cage, right? It really forces the not possible interpretation. But if you say the lion may not be in the same cage, then the surface scope interpretation is much more safe, right? Now, so let's take, so this is, I think this is a kind of potential confound. So if you really want to know what's going on, you should test both verbs, right? And then they might say, yeah, but may is probably low frequency, is probably less used by children, right? Sure. But that's something you want to look into. Second, let's take may. So let's pretend that this sentence would have been the lion may not be in the same cage as a tiger. Okay, and what that would mean is that it's like it's possible for you not to put the lion in the same cage as the tiger, because probably there could be some problems, right? That's kind of the intuition behind this kind of context. You never know what the tiger and the lion are going to do. Maybe they're going to be friends, maybe they're going to slaughter each other to death. So in this case, if we have, let's say, a surface scope interpretation, okay, so if we have the lion may not be in the same cage as the tiger, right? This configuration would still be, this interpretation would still be logically compatible with a stronger interpretation, right? So you can say, the lion may not be in the same cage as the tiger. In fact, it's better if you don't put it in the same cage as the tiger, because you don't want to risk to hurt them, right? So you can use that sentence in a way to sort of to say something weaker for that you don't have a lot of evidence about, and then you can strengthen it again. And that really reminds of scalar implicatures, right? In fact, there is a very strong scalar implicator here messing up with the interpretation, right? So can you tell me which one it is? If you say the lion may not be in the same cage as the tiger, what would be the scalar implicator? It's a little bit like sum, right? Model existentials behave a little bit like sum. So if you say, some of the children did not go to school today, what would be the scalar implicator that you can derive on that?
That some of them did.
Yes, right? So that's a little bit tricky with respect to the sentence with allegation, because then you would say some but not all. And in this case, it would be kind of the same, but then you have negation play around, right? So in this case, what would be the implicature then, following the same reasoning from the sentence, the lion may not be in the same cage?
Like it may also be.
Right. The lion may not be in the same cage, but it actually may be in the cage, right? And right, so if you do derive this implicature, then that's actually what's going to tell you that you can actually put the lion in the tiger, right? So I mean, we don't know really the prediction with respect to this kind of experiment, but if we had may not instead of cannot, and if we had a surface scope interpretation of may not, and if we derive a scalar implicature on top of that, that is actually what would make us accept or answer yes to this question, okay? But then again, you can see how the context plays out, right? So you might think if you adopt like, you know, sort of the context here would lead you to adopt sort of a safe strategy, right? Like a better be safe than sorry, because you don't want to have problems with the zoo, right? So the pragmatics of the context would tell you, had we used may not in this sentence, that would tell you that you have to defeat the implicature because you don't want to risk your tiger to mess up with the lion. So this would be a typical context that does not support implicature, right? So you see how all these effects in a way contribute also to affect the derivation of implicatures and also the derivation of scope configurations. Okay, so I guess the reason why they wanted to choose this context was exactly to try to make the inverse scope interpretation salient, right? Because here the context would support the let's say the universal negative meaning of the model, so that you cannot do that and you should not do that, right? So that they wanted to facilitate this interpretation. But then, you know, again, it's interesting to see if you really have a construction that allows for the surface scope interpretation, right? That would give you a scalar inference, which would actually support, in this case, the idea of putting the lion with the tiger. Okay, is this clear? Do you see what I'm saying? Good. So yeah, so this is all about, you know, this kind of relationship that have not been really understood between scope configurations and pragmatic enriching, right? And there are a lot of cues that point to the conjecture that these things interact together. And one of these cues is that both these phenomenon appear to be sensitive to entailment, to informativity, to logical strength, but also to the property of the context and how the context interacts with these more kind of logical issues, right? So this is a very important thing, and this is something that a lot of people have not understood very well in the field, okay? So it's really important to see how your extra-linguistic context is going to push you towards one way or the other, but also how that is going to be, in a way, taken into account when you have a pure grammatical or a pure logical reasoning with respect to the meaning of the sentence, okay? Another thing that I want to ask you, could you go back to the very, very initial example? When you were, yes. So, right. So, so now I have a $1 million question for you, okay? So if you remember when we discussed Fox and Myers and Spector, right? They claim that you cannot have inverse scope when you get a stronger interpretation. You can only get inverse scope, and in particular scope shift. So scope shift is the operation that is supposed to give you inverse scope, right? When you get either a weaker or a semantically independent interpretation, right? So my question would be, now let's ignore Italian, right? Because not everyone speaks Italian here. So let's translate these sentences into English, okay? My question is, what would be a configuration, either using the possibility model or the necessity model? What would be a configuration where we predict, adopting Meyer and Fox and Benjamin's principle, that we do not have inverse scope? So what would be a configuration where if we switch the order of the scope bearing elements, we are going to get a logically strong interpretation? That's $1 million question. And yeah, that's right.
Can I just ask something?
Sure, sure.
So are you asking if are we allowed to switch this modal for another, or?
Yes.
Okay, so if we take the modal must, that one has only one interpretation, right?
In which position?
Well, instead of cannot, must not, or something.
Must not. Good.
Yeah.
So the lion must not be in the same cage with the tiger, right? So now we are starting from our intuition, right? So you're saying, you know, according to my intuition, there's no way that in English, a sentence like the lion must not be in the same cage with the tiger is going to give you does not have two interpretations, right? That's what, right?
It's funny because in German it's the same. It also only has one interpretation, but it's the other one. Interestingly, I think.
Right. Do you have two different models for must in German?
So if you say must not in German, it means it doesn't have to.
Right. But do you have a word like have to in German?
I don't know. Somebody help me out.
Doesn't have to, just muss?
You only have muss.
Yeah, only must, yeah.
You cannot say you have to finish your homework by using the verb to have.
Ich glaube, das kann man. I think we can
Yeah,
say
you
that.
can. Yeah.
Du hast deine Hausaufgaben zu machen, but it sounds a bit weird, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, it's like Italian. It's really like Italian, right?
But it's the weird thing though is that must not in German means nicht dürfen. It's like you're not allowed to, and it doesn't mean you don't have to.
So it's a deontic model, right? Yeah.
Is Mike here today?
Yeah. So how do you say in German?
Like if I said in English, the lion must not be in the same cage as the tiger, I could interpret that as like if they get together in the cage, that's a catastrophe, so that it must not. But also I could say it must not, but it may.
That's not the
Well, I don't think that
English. That's not the English meaning of it though.
It's just your German intuition, I
English.
think.
I think you're translating your German into English, right?
Yeah, it's translated too literally.
Yeah, so I guess what you want to say is that also, you know, the lion must not be in the same cage with the tiger. I mean, okay, the lion doesn't not really have a strong, you know, sort of a rule book to follow, right? But like the idea is that you have this model versus epistemic duty, where the ontic meaning would be that according to the rules, that doesn't have to happen, right? Whereas in the epistemic interpretation, there would be that according to the, you know, the sort of the how the events would unfold basically, and the sort of the external circumstances that will not happen. That's not compatible with our understanding of how things work, right? But what I wanted to ask, so that's actually a very interesting example, because we have this nice difference between English and German, right? But the Myers and Spector's paper was making a very strong prediction, right? So their prediction is that there should be a configuration where this is not allowed by certain economy constraints. And that is the configuration where if you switch the order of the operators, you get a stronger meaning. So my question is, if we have must not, right? The lion must not be in the same cage with the tiger. Would that be a configuration where we predict that the inverse scope is available or not? So by switching must not to not must, do we get something stronger or weaker?
I think something weaker, maybe.
Something weaker, right? So, yeah. So a useful way to understand these kind of things is to think about necessity models as universal quantifiers. In fact, that's how they are modeled in formal semantics. So they're like universal quantifiers ranging over possible words, right? So this, like, must not would be exactly the same configuration as every horse didn't jump over the fence, okay? So this is a configuration where we predict to have inverse scope. On the other hand, if you have an Italian sentence like non deve, right? Then it's like not must, and that would be the configuration where where if you switch the order of the operators, you get a stronger meaning, because then you get the universal negative, right? And that would be the same thing as in does not have to in English, basically, right? So in English, you see that. We doesn't have to. And probably in German as well. Wait, German? Yes, in German you see that, right? So Germany is actually behaving in a very, loyal to Meyer's principle, because you just told me that if you say muss nicht, it means doesn't have to, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's that. So did you see what I'm saying? Do you see what I'm referring to, right?
Mm-hmm.
That if you make this parallel between models and quantifiers, then when you have a muss nicht, then it should really be interpreted as not necessity, right? But when you have nicht muss, or whatever that is, then it could not be interpreted in the inverse form. But that's not what happens in Italian, right? Especially this is a sentence that children hear a lot of time, because their parents tell them, non devi, you must not throw your food on the ground, okay? In Italian would be non devi buttare il cibo per terra, okay? And that clearly means that you don't have to do that. Not that you're not supposed to do that, or you don't have to do that, or you don't have to. Oh my God! I know.
Can I just ask something?
Please.
Yeah, this is because in Italian there are two, like the meaning of potere and dovere are different comparing to the other languages. So how? Like this difference from Italian in other languages is not the same? Or?
Yeah, well, it's a mystery, right? We don't know.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So, I mean, I guess the comparison between German and English is very telling, right? Because, Italian is quite different from German and English, especially in the system of negation and in the system of modals and these kind of things. But English and German are actually quite similar, right? So I guess the idea is that there are certain syntactic constraints on which scope configuration are allowed and which are not, right? And that's it basically. So, one interesting question is, why do we have these differences, right? And then, one of the possibilities that in certain languages you have different alternatives or different alternative ways to express the same meaning. So, for instance, this was an issue when you compare German with other languages with keine, right? So in Italian is a negative concord language, so you would use something like keine with negation, but in German, if you use keine, you don't use negation, right? But here in this case, it's not so clear what the reason for this is. So, for instance, in Italian, you can say puoi non. You can say il leone può non stare nella stessa gabbia. So the lion can not stay in the same cage as the tiger, and then you can switch the words. So you can say non può stare. Okay? So non può would be literally not can. Okay? So this is very strong. You can, if you say non può, right? There's no way you can have the inverse scope interpretation. So if you say literally the lion may not be in the same cage as the tiger, you cannot have the lion not may or not can. You cannot even say that in English, right? But yeah, so with the negation before the model, okay? So
wait, so in Italian you always access the surface scope.
In Italian, it looks like you always have the surface scope with the possibility model. Yes.
Okay.
So if you say not can, there's no way you can have inverse scope, and if you say can not, there's no way you can inverse scope. You can have inverse scope. Exactly. So the scope of possibility models is completely fixed in this simple configuration, right? And then you can play with other predicates. So you might say, okay, I want to check if this is true if I have a covert negation. So you can say, I doubt that you can finish your homework. Okay, so it would be dubito tu possa finire I compiti. And again, the question is whether you can get the interpretation where I think that there is a possibility that you cannot that you're not going to finish your homework, and that's not allowed, and that's not available. So I doubt you can finish your homework means that I believe that you cannot finish your homework. Okay, that's the only thing. So yeah, so this is interesting, really interesting, and as far as I know, no one has really worked this out, and unless you stipulate that this model can do this and this other model cannot do this, right? But yeah, if there is anything interesting to this, is that probably in English, the reason that you cannot switch the order of not and can might be related to this constraint on the scope configuration. Okay, so then it's kind of a chicken egg problem. So we don't really know if it is because you cannot switch the order in the overt linear order, then you cannot have certain interpretation, or if it's that because you cannot get certain interpretation that you cannot use words in different order. I think it's more like the first explanation, but I'm not sure. Okay, so thanks so much. Yeah, so I guess this is kind of probably it for our scope ambiguity discussions. Okay, and so now we are gonna in the next. I'm not sure about the Tears paper, but I think there was about plural inferences. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. We'll see. But at least we are going to focus a little bit more on implicatures. Okay. So if you have some questions, some doubts, some stuff you want to talk about scope ambiguity and scope configurations, please tell me. So then we can consider that. Okay. Otherwise, yeah, we are kind of talking about implicatures a lot in the next times. So yes, let's take a short break, okay? And then we have Alexa and Bernadette talking about some very interesting experiments on the acquisition of implicatures, okay? So see you in like 5, 6, 7 minutes. Yeah, so if you don't mind waiting 1 minute, then. Okay.
Okay. I'm talking about the Papafragou and Tantalou paper from 2004 on children's computation of implicatures. It's a very short paper, so it's going to be a short presentation. Very simple and easy to follow. The central question of this paper and the experiment behind it was whether children can compute implicatures and if they can compute implicatures of different kinds. Tantalou and Papafragou note at the beginning of their paper in regards to previous existing research that it had to, up to that date, so 2004, that research was focused heavily on the acceptability of weaker scholarly expressions when stronger ones are warranted, and claimed that that is not a realistic simulation of real-life natural speech. They also said that they think that previously done judgment tasks possibly underestimated preschoolers' linguistic and pragmatic abilities when it comes to real-life conversations. So through their methodology, they tried to research several different kinds of implicatures and their computation by children, and whether they previously used formats of research had something to do with the children's apparent difficulties in understanding scalar implicatures. So the setup of the experiments was, there was a test group that consisted of 30 Greek-speaking children between the ages of 4-1 to 6-1, all recruited at a daycare center in Athens. And all questions and answers from the experiment were translated from Greek to English for the paper. The children were presented a group of animals and asked to play a game with them. And in the game, each animal will be assigned a job. And depending on whether the animal had completed the job, the children should reward the animal with a prize or not. The 30 children were divided into groups of 10, each group being assigned a different type of implicature. The first one was the quantification implicature, which would be something like the sum all implicature. And the following slide will provide an example for that kind of trial. Then secondly, we have the encyclopedic implicature, which involves world knowledge and visual keys. For example, one of the assigned jobs was for an animal to eat a sandwich. And after it's done eating the sandwich, it's asked whether it ate the sandwich. And the animal responds, I ate the cheese. So there's kind of an implicature there, but it's not scalar. And they call it an encyclopedic implicature. And lastly, there's what they call the ad hoc condition, which is arbitrary and introduces context-based and circumstantial questions. So it's not about a specific set of words that belong to one implicature. An example for this one would be an animal being assigned the task of wrapping 2 gifts, being a toy parrot and a doll. And when the animal was done, it was asked if it had wrapped the gifts, and it would say, I wrapped the doll. These are the 3 different kinds of implicatures that the researchers tested for.
Sorry, can I ask you to
to explain me again the encyclopedic implicature?
That one is, for example, with the sandwich and the cheese. So we know that, I think, at least that's how I understood it, that in a sandwich there usually is cheese and ham and salad. So that's like a set kind of concept, I guess.
Yeah.
Sorry, and if I say I ate the cheese, it's implied that I didn't eat the whole sandwich, but we all know that in a sandwich there's cheese.
Aha, wow. Yeah, so it's still a sort of, it's a kind of ad hoc implicature, but it's based on the encyclopedic knowledge, right?
Yes, it's like world knowledge.
Right. So it's not, because by encyclopedic, I thought about, these kind of examples like some elephants are mammals, where you still have to think about your knowledge, but it's triggered by a quantifier. So this would still be triggered not by some, right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right, and then there were also control trials, which included no implicatures. For example, one of the controls was a worm being assigned the task of reading a book, and after it was done, the worm was asked if it completed the task, and it said, yes, I read the book, and it was very fun. So the children were expected to reward the animals in the control trials a prize. And each child received 4 control trials and 4 test trials. So the experiment is laid out here. Here's a quantificational implicature. An elephant is given 4 paper stars and is asked to color them. The elephant goes into a house to color them in private and then comes back after supposedly completing the task. The elephant is then asked, did you color the stars? And it responds, I colored some. Now, the implication here is if the children can compute the implicature in which some is not compatible with all, meaning the elephant did not color all the stars, which means it did not complete the task, they will not reward the elephant with a prize. If, however, the children do not compute the implicature and interpret some as being compatible with all, they will give the elephant a prize. And the results were the following. Children overwhelmingly refused to give the animal the prize, which was correct, which means they computed the implicatures with the most accuracy with the ad hoc conditions, then the quantificational trials, and lastly, the encyclopedic trials. And the same tendencies are shown in the control trials that they did. And what's more, in the majority of cases, the children even gave the right justifications for refusing to give the animal the prize, such as they referred to the stronger quantifier like all. So when they were asked, why didn't you give the elephant a prize, they would say, he didn't color all the stars. Or they used words like only, like he only ate the cheese to explain their decision. And discussions, the findings suggest a number of things. Firstly, that young children are able to compute different kinds of implicatures, from scalar ones based on logical attainment to more arbitrary implicatures such as the ad hoc conditions with the true presence. Children can also assess levels of informativeness and compare linguistic stimulus with what could have been said, which is to say that they understand that technically the quantifier all could have been used, but since it was not, the sentence containing all must not be true. In short, they're able to compute implicatures, at least in this specific setting and context. Tantalou and Papafragou argue that this comparison and consideration of contrastive alternatives to the linguistic stimulus is also based on other evidence, a very active part of language acquisition. These results, however, contrast heavily with the previous data that suggests that children have difficulty computing scalar implicatures, and it suggests that different kinds of implicatures are actually equal in the level of computing. That's all I have.
Thank you. Very, very, very good. Right, yeah. So, surprised. Now children are perfectly fine at computing implicatures, right?
Yeah.
So, do they, if you remember, say anything about why other people got different results in other experiments?
They do mention like previous research. I didn't really understand all the words in it, but they kind of said that their way of doing it in this experiment was more like how implicatures are used in actual natural speech in daily life, and that in previous research, the sentences children had to try to compute and understand were not as natural. So it wasn't really accurate, like an accurate representation of how children do in real life.
So usually, that's kind of thing that psychologists like to say, when they get some very nice results, they say, yes, because our experiment was better than the other experiments, right? So we managed to explain things very well. We managed to make it very felicitous. We managed to make it very nice. And then, we actually are the best designers of the experiment. Now, this might be true in a way, but do you think that there is something in their experiment that actually made their participants be particularly pragmatic more than in other studies?
I mean, I did feel like their what they asked the children to do were kind of easy. But I can't really explain it because I don't know what previous research is like, but I just felt like it was very easy, and like the child might understand what they're trying to get it to say because it was very on the nose. But yeah, I'm not sure.
That's really cool. Does anyone have any idea?
I have a. So, what did the children answer this in the sandwich situation again?
They didn't give the animal the prize, and they said it's because the animal didn't eat all of the sandwich, for example.
Okay, but wasn't there something? Oh, okay, never mind.
Or they said it only ate the cheese, stuff like that.
Oh yeah. So they were showing the animal. So the question was, did the animal eat the cheese, right?
No, the animal is asked if it ate the sandwich.
Oh, okay. I see.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Right. So, I mean, again, you actually, your point is right. We haven't talked about the studies where children failed computing the implicature a lot, right? So we haven't talked about this famous study by Novak. Someone actually offered to present this study, but I said, it's kind of, I think we mentioned, we actually did talk about, I guess Aziz's presentation was about Katsas and Bishop, who had one condition in their experiment, or one version in their experiment, where they used a binary judgment and they got very, very low rate of implicatures, right? Yeah. That was an example, right? So this is interesting, and this is very puzzling, and this is, this is the example of why in the literature there is a lot of debate still nowadays about why sometimes children compute implicatures and why sometimes they seem not to compute implicatures, right? Or why sometimes they're more tolerant about pragmatic violations. Right, what is the title of this article, says Maria. I don't know, Maria, did I share all these articles with the people that are not enrolled in Moodle? Maybe I didn't. Maybe I'm gonna share it as a Dropbox folder, okay? But the title of this article was Children's Computation of Implicatures, right? And that's Papafragou and Tantalou, right?
Yeah.
So I remember it as the Tantalou's paper, because Papafragou has a lot of papers. She's like a senior professor, but then she collaborates with many other people. Right. So does anyone have an idea about why were they so successful at rejecting implicature violation in these studies, or at deriving implicatures? So I have one intuition about this. If you go back to the previous slide, when you were mentioning the critical item, when there was, yes, right? So So here the question was, so there was an explicit question, right? That said, did you color the stars?
Yes.
Right? And then the answer was, I colored some.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this idea in the literature that if you put focus, like information focus or intonational focus,
Mm-hmm.
on the scalar item, then the implicature becomes much, much stronger. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, as you might know, focus is a sort of intonation feature, is something that you can like whose scope you can mark with your intonation, right? But also there are other ways, which is also connected to the intonation, which is, for instance, a question and answer pair, right? So if you ask something referring to the whole set of objects that you are talking about, right? And if the answer to this question includes a weaker item, a weak scalar trigger, like some, then the scope of the focus is kind of obligatorily put on the scalar item. So, you know, a lot of people notice that if you have this kind of question answer pairs, like, did you talk to all the students? I talked to some of them, right? This kind of use of some and scalar triggers, in a way, makes the implicature almost obligatory. So you cannot really say, if you ask me, did you talk to all of the students? If I tell you, well, I talked to some of them, in fact, I talked to all of them, you sound really a sort of like a Greek philosopher from you know, the first centuries after Christ, right? So it's you know, it really sounds contradictory. Do you share this feeling? Do you share this intuition?
Yeah, well, personally, I think that's why it felt so on the nose for me. And they did mention towards the end of their paper that it's open to discussion whether if they had asked different questions or like just asked, what did you do to the animal, they might have gotten very different results. So they are kind of like aware of that. But yeah, I think that's why it felt so on the nose, because it's like, I don't know. Yeah. Even if it's a child, I think it will understand. Right. It's very like obvious.
Right. But again, you know, it's like for us, it was also obvious in the other experiment, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that's true.
So, but this suggests that there is really something about, there is a very tight connection between this scalar implicature derivation and the linguistic properties of the context, right? So, you know, I don't know if you noticed that when we talk about context, it's actually, context is a very, very vague terminology. It's a very vague definition. So by context, you might think about the extra-linguistic context, right? The objects that are salient in our domain of conversation, or the linguistic context, which is also something like every horse jumped over the log, but every horse didn't jump over the fence, right? So if you start playing with the linguistic context, then you might get some effects that are really, really strong. Like for instance, if you directly include in your question the something that is describing the whole set of objects that we are referring to, not only you are making the strong alternative that you need to compute the implicature very salient, right? So this could be one of the reasons why they got the higher rate of implicatures, because the alternative that you need to compute the implicature is super salient. So then you have to use it. But also, in addition to this, if you have this question answer pair, and if you have the scalar trigger in the answer, then it becomes super strong. Then it becomes on focus. And when scalar triggers are on focus, you get this obligatoriness effect of the implicature, okay? And again, this is a problem for the standard pragmatic theory of implicature, because how do you explain that? If implicatures are derived by your automatic reasoning, why should you have these effects driven by purely linguistic operators like focus, right? So this is an important issue. And I think, this is a very, very strong effect. Okay. Do you agree with what I'm saying? Do you see what I'm
completely.
referring to? Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So I guess we should move to the next paper. So then we can also have a little bit of discussion of that. Thanks so much. It was really good.
Thank you.
So, can you see it?
I guess Alexandra has to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Do I have to start?
Stop the sharing. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Nice. This works really well.
Okay. So my paper was Scalar Inferences in 5-year-olds, the role of alternatives by Skordos and Papafragou. And it fits really nicely. It continues the topic about the question about how big the problems with children and implicatures are. And I don't know how necessary it is to remind ourselves about the scalar inferences and implicature, but maybe I can remind you a little bit, like scalar inferences. We understand under scalar inferences, pragmatic inferences that generate a certain lexical item that are generated by a certain lexical items like quantifiers. In this case, some and all. And these sets are called scalar because they are ordered in informational strength. And all of this is based on the asymmetrical logical entailment. And we have spoken about this also, and it's like the stronger scalar item entails the weaker item, like all of the monkeys left the cage, entails that some of the monkeys left the cage, but not the other way around. And then we have also spoken about Grice and implicature. And I want to mention flouting here, which means that you sort of violate a certain cooperative effort in the conversation. And that's always interpreted that by the hearer that there's some reason behind that. So if I say, some of the monkeys left the cage, then that would imply that not all of the monkeys have left the cage. And so in children, as we heard, there are some studies that have to make the conclusion that the children until until they're 10 years old, they have problems computing these scalar implicatures. And I can't really go into any details here, but there's one study that, or maybe I can. We spoke about Novak, and he concluded that for children they mostly use the logical interpretation of sentences, and adults use more like ambivalent and sometimes the logical and sometimes a pragmatic interpretation. But he also concluded that like task demands and special context and more naturalistic tasks would make a difference in the understanding of these scalar implicatures by children. And like this example that I wanted to show you is by Barner, Brooks, and Bale. And they presented children with the sentence, and they had a really hard time to conclude that only some of the animals are sleeping, that this would mean that not all of the animals are sleeping. So that was difficult for children. And but if you when set members were like they were individuated, then they could answer like a question. If they heard the sentence only the cat and the dog are sleeping, and then you ask them, does the cow sleep? Then it was easy for them to say the cow is not sleeping. And this implies that if you offer like the possible scale mates for children, then they don't have as much as a problem to generate these scalar implicatures. And so, as I've written down here, young children face significant difficulties with accessing the necessary scalar alternatives in order to generate the SI. And yeah, if you have a contrast between the strong all and the weak sum, then these scalar alternatives are more available. But then there's the question, why do children have these difficulties? And yeah, with this to access these scalar alternatives. And this study wanted to find it out, and they had two hypotheses that would be possible. There is on one hand the lean hypothesis, which says that children simply do not know what alternatives enter into a scalar relationship. And if that is the case, then it would simply suffice to provide them an alternative, and then they would be able to come up with the scalar implicatures. And then there's the rich hypothesis, which thinks that children do not always realize when alternatives are relevant, and just giving them the possible alternatives isn't enough, because they need to be aware of a certain goal that is relevant for the discourse. And I know I don't know, it's a bit difficult to understand maybe, but like the experiment they did was there were these plickets that are these animals, and in each oh sorry, yeah, yeah, okay, maybe there were 4 different types of tests. So there were either 4 plickets who sorry, I think I lost my I don't know. I think I'm back now. Sorry. Okay, so these plickets, and there were several items that these plickets could have, and there were either like a full set of plickets, so that means there are 4 of them, or it means that they all of them had the item, or there were only 3 out of 4 of them had the item. So you see there are only 3 of them there, and here 4 of them have this item. And then there yeah, and you can, so there are like 4 resulting conditions you can get out of this. So the true all, so the children would be asked, all of the plickets have an umbrella, and this would be true. And yeah, and then the false all, like all of the plickets have a scarf, but the 3 of 4 out of 4 of them have a scarf, so this is wrong. Then there's the true and felicitous sum condition, and there are some of the plickets have a racket, but only 3 out of 4 of them have a racket. And then there's true and infelicitous sum, which means that some of the plickets have a crayon, but in fact all of them have a crayon. So there were so this was an acceptability judgment task, and there were 50 5-year-old children and a group out of 24 adults for control. And there were so as you see here, like these 3 tasks were to test like their judgment on sum and all, And that task is like the critical one. This one is to test their pragmatic judgment. And there were 4 types of trials, because every 4 of these trials was repeated 4 times, and there were 16 trials as a result. And then they out of this concluded there was a quantity condition and the object condition, and these conditions were separated to find out if the lean condition was true, or a lean or the ridge hypothesis was correct. So the difference between the 2 of them was that in the quantity condition on the left, the goal of the conversation remained stable, and in the object condition, the goal changed. So in the first one, you see the children were asked, all of the duplicates have a scarf, and the important thing is that they had to see like the number. There are 3 scarves and 4 duplicates, so it's and so the object is correct, but the number of objects is wrong. And then in the second in the infelicitous sum condition, the objects are also correct, but the number is wrong. And for the second experiment, the number was in the first one, the number was it was all of the duplicates have a scarf, so the number is correct, but they have not a scarf but a shovel. So it's not about the number, but about the object that is shown. And so in the second experiment, the second block, there were shown not the object was the important thing, but the number. So you see, first you have to they have to focus on the objects, and then on the number, and for the other condition, only the number was important. So first they were always shown the all sentences with all, so that they this this implicature was so this inference was shown to them. So yeah, this stayed the same, and the results were that adults didn't have any problems with this, and there was only one failure, and then children had most of the children didn't have a problem with the quantity condition, but when it came to the true and infelicitous condition, they you see they had like 16 failures and only 8 passes in the objects condition, which is much more than 9 failures and 17 passes in the quantity condition. And then there was made a second rounds where people were excluded, children were excluded who had problems on the semantic front, and then the conclusion was even stronger, that children were had almost adult-like behavior on the quantity condition, but had really problems on the object condition. So the study concluded that this was like a strong sign to that it was like the ridge hypothesis, because the scalar alternatives are shown, but the conversational goal is the important difference, and it's important in this for children to interpret implicatures. Yeah, I'm sorry, it's a bit complicated, and then to bring it, to bring it to you in a concise form was a bit difficult. But maybe you got the idea.
No, but thank you. It was very clear. I have one question. Can you remind me how they coded passers and failures, right? Because in the other experiment, we were always looking at the proportion of acceptance or rejections, whereas here, right, they do this kind of different coding.
Yeah, that's interesting. They had a true and a false outcome in mind for every sentence. So there wasn't, maybe if I, oh, did I close the, no, am I still on the screen share?
Yeah, we still see.
Okay, I can't access it now. Okay. I don't know where would be a good, but so there were correct answers and wrong answers, and like that's the difference.
So I guess they coded they set up a threshold, right? So that like something like if they answer more than half of the trials with the correct pragmatic response, they would be coded as passers, right? Whereas if they answered in more than half of the trials in the wrong way, then they would be coded as failures. Although it would be interesting to see the exact threshold, but I don't remember the name of these. Can you remind me the name of the file? Skordos Papafragou. Yeah, there you go. So let me quickly look because I don't remember this paper. I read it. Coding, yeah. So the answer were coded as correct in case blah blah blah. Yeah, sure. Right. Those were used to categorize participants according to their performance. Right. So if they had score of 75% or greater, they would be coded as passers. Okay. And if they had achieved a score of 50% of less, they would be coded as failures. Okay. So you see, this is kind of tricky. So like usually you want to have an homogeneous way of coding your participants, right? Whereas they clearly bias this way of coding towards towards the positive limit, basically. So it's like 50% of less, you're a failure. 70% or more, you are a passer. Okay. So which means that in the last graph you presented, right? Where they probably excluded those who had problems with the control trials. Then you got this, then you got this, 16% of failures, right? So 16 children. So these 16 failures probably they some of them were a chance, right? And some of them were systematic in accepting the pragmatic violation, right? Whereas the passers were very, very consistent in behaving pragmatically. Cool. So another question that I have to ask you. So just because this is, as you said, a little bit tricky, right? So what was exactly the condition in which they behaved much better? So in the quantity condition they were much better, right? And in the object condition they were much worse. Can you show me again? Yeah.
Yeah, and also only so like in this like first of they were shown this example, and then they were shown this one, and this is like in the true and infelicitous sum case, then they were like they were okay, but in the object and true and infelicitous sum case they were much weaker. And I don't know how much it is like concerning about is a reason because of the, I mean, it's much more confusing on its own, that there's like, I don't know how much this is like a linguistic problem. That was what I was confused about, but
right. So let's so can you expand this picture?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Put it in the I mean, this is interesting, right? I mean, it's we don't really know what's going on, but it's an interesting effect. So does anyone have any idea about this? Why do you think they did much better in the object condition in the quantity condition than in the object condition? So they claim because the goal of the conversation remains stable, right? But that sounds really weird to me, because the goal of the conversation is kind of the same, right? So what really changes is that in the quantity condition, so the object was kept the same, right? So the idea is that the reason why all of the Blickets have scarf is not that that all of them have something else, right? But that only a few of them have a scarf, right? Whereas in the reason why all the Blickets have a scarf is wrong in the object condition is that it's really a mismatch about the object. So I guess, yeah. So I guess focusing on focusing on the issue about the quantity of the object across trials, in a way facilitate your reasoning about the numerosity of the set denoted by the quantifier, and not on the issue about whether that kind of object is right or wrong, right?
Mhm.
So does anyone have any thought about this, or any comment, or any idea? I mean, one of the possibilities is that shifting the object is not just about focusing the attention of a different aspect of the sentence, whether it's the numerosity or the kind of object predicated in the sentence, right? But it's also might also have effect on where you actually put certain elements in a certain scopal configuration, right? So if you can see that by saying, for instance, in the example, in the quantity condition, right? You could correct that sentence by saying, no, it's not true that all of the Blickets have a scarf. Some of the Blickets have a scarf. Whereas in the object condition, you can correct that sentence by saying, it's not true that all of the Blickets have a scarf. All of the Blickets have a bracket or whatever, right? So that in a way kind of might activate a parallel sentence, a parallel utterance that is salient in the discourse that would fix this problem, right? And by building up that, basically you sort of you play on the question and the discussion, which also means that you play on the alternatives that you're considering in order to evaluate these sentences. So that really reminds me a little bit about the contextual manipulation in Litz and Musolino experiment, when they introduced the every horse jumped over the log, but every horse didn't jump over the fence, right? Did you see the parallelism a little bit? So that's very interesting. Okay, thanks a lot for your presentation. So when I'm gonna upload this video online, I will also add Joanna's presentation, okay? So that we have all these presentations online. Thank you very much. Again, keep up with the good job. And I guess if there is no other questions or comments, we are gonna see each other on.
I'm talking about the paper Scope Ambiguity in Child Language, All the New Problems, which was written by Gualmini. And this article is concerned with the resolution of scope ambiguity in child language, with focus on the role of pragmatic factors and with focus on the fact that this domain involves different linguistic levels. First, Gualmini presents an influential experiment of Musolino. He wanted to find out whether children do have access to inverse scope interpretation with the sentences that you can see now, that all involve negation and a quantifier. And the children were presented with context and made the inverse scope interpretation of these sentences true. For example, for the first sentence, some horses had already jumped over the fence, but one hadn't. And the results were that children denied the inverse scope interpretation and preferred the surface scope interpretation, and Mussolino proposed to explain this phenomenon through the idea of isomorphism, and assumed that children choose the surface scope interpretation to a larger extent than adults do. Therefore, it was necessary to find distinct factors that are responsible for the preference that children have for the surface scope interpretation. And Mussolino assumed that children will use the inverse scope interpretation if they could access it because of the principle of cooperation and the maxim of quality. But he assumes that the inverse scope interpretation is not available for the children because they've never learned the existence of such interpretations and they have no access to them. And the second thing he assumes is that the difference lies in a particular grammar that children and adults entertain. Now we move on to data that refines Mussolino's assumptions and theory and shows evidence against the view of isomorphism. This was made by Gualmini in 2003 and 2004. And the studies demonstrate that children can access both scope interpretations. Gualmini found out that negative sentences are used to show a discrepancy between the expected outcome and the actual outcome, and to test if expectations can mitigate children's difficulty with sentences like the ones on the first slide. Gualmini confronted them with stories. For example, a troll had to deliver 4 pizzas, and on his way, 2 pizzas fell off the delivery truck. After the story, the children had to evaluate the 2 sentences. The troll didn't deliver some pizzas, and the troll didn't lose some pizzas. Of course, the both sentences are true under consideration on the inverse scope interpretation, and 34 and 5-year-old children participated in the experiment. The results were that in 90% of the trials, the children accepted sentence 1, and in 50% they accepted sentence 2. And this shows that these contexts led children to access the inverse scope interpretation to a higher extent than observed in previous literature. Mussolino thought that it is not even possible for children to access it, and Gualmini shows that it is possible for them to access it in specific contexts. Another evidence against the view of isomorphism comes from Mussolino and Litz in 2006, and they demonstrated that children can access both interpretations in sentences like "every horse didn't jump over the fence," and they also found out that they are choosing the inverse scope interpretation to a larger extent in sentences like "every horse jumped over the log, but every horse didn't jump over the fence." This led to the findings that children's behavior changes across contexts, and the original view of isomorphism was challenged. Mussolino and Litz argued that the adult's preference for the inverse scope interpretation results from a pragmatic reason. Adults prefer the inverse scope interpretation because they interpret sentences like "every horse didn't jump over the fence" as "not all the horses jumped over the fence," because there is another way to say that no horse jumped over the fence, namely the sentence "no horse jumped over the fence." They also proposed that children prefer surface scope interpretations over true inverse scope interpretations, although they have access. Yet all the studies that we've seen before share the assumption that the difference between children and adults is that children prefer surface scope interpretation. But a new working strategy was to see if contextual factors can help children in overcoming the default tendency. For example, a study by Halsey, Hawkworth, Fox, and Gualmini in 2004 called the question-answer requirement. They asked children questions, and the children had to select a scope interpretation which allows them to answer the question. They asked, in this case, did the troll deliver all the pizzas? And in case of the troll didn't deliver some pizzas, both interpretations entail an answer to the question, and the children can make use of the principle of charity and can use the best interpretation for this question. For example, there are some pizzas that the troll didn't deliver. And in case of the troll didn't lose some pizzas, only the surface scope interpretation addresses the relevant question, and the principle of charity is violated, and the only relevant interpretation is selected. A prediction of this model is that for any context, children should prefer the same interpretation, regardless of whether it amounts to surface or inverse scope. And Halsey et al. Corroborated this prediction by testing children's interpretation of the following sentences. Some pizzas were not delivered and some pizzas were not lost. And all the English-speaking children accepted the sentence 1, but half of them rejected sentence 2, and that closely mirrors the results that Gualmini had before. And a control group with adults accepted both sentences, and this shows that the difference between children and adults does not take the shape that isomorphism expected. The results show that children can select the inverse scope interpretation. For example, it is not the case that some pizzas were lost in the same context in which adults select surface scope. The way children resolve ambiguity has stirred much debate, but a different issue has been overlooked, namely the fact that children maybe have access to an ambiguity adults don't. And under this assumption, children may be facing a learnability problem, and children's development must include the expansion of one reading. A proposal was made by Gualmini and Schwarz in 2007. They used this dialogue. Speaker A says some pizzas were not lost, and speaker B says, well, no pizza was lost. Speaker A's utterance is in this case uncooperative because some receives wide scope over the negation. And therefore, the proposition that some pizzas were not lost triggers the implicature that some pizzas were indeed lost. But this implicature is not met in the context since no pizza was lost. If some could receive narrow scope below the negation, speaker A's utterance would be true and cooperative, but speaker B cannot generate that meaning. Speaker B has no choice but to access the interpretation that gives rise to such an implicature. And any witness to the dialogue above who cannot compute scalar implicature would not be able to understand the sense of speaker B's reply. Speaker B's reply is in fact consistent with the surface scope interpretation of speaker A's utterance. And given that young children often been reported not to compute scalar implicatures, the consequences for the learner are, even though the relevant question might be there, at the initial state of language development, children might not be able to make use of it. And only when they are able to compute scalar implicatures, they can draw and understand these dialogues. And maybe this also explains why 5-year-old children are able to interpret some in the scope of negation to a larger extent than adults do. And this reasoning that they made has far-reaching consequences. The idea that children might be able to bootstrap from syntax to semantic and from semantic to syntax has generated a great body of research. And to summarize it, Gualmini discusses issues regarding scope ambiguity, for example, whether children have access to inverse scope and to what extent. And he also mentions that the interaction between several different models and different linguistic levels makes the researcher's task harder and has also benefits, for example, that the learner might have access to multiple sources of information. At the end of his article, he also says that there is still a lot of research potential left.